The first photo arrived in a plain white envelope, slid under the door of Ilara Vance's downtown studio. It wasn't a note or a print of her own work. It was a physical photograph, glossy and crisp, and it took the air right out of her lungs. It was a picture of her. Ilara was standing in the window of her own studio apartment, a small glass of wine held loosely in her hand. The window was framed by the dark granite of the building facade, and the lights of the city glittered behind her, giving the shot a strange, cinematic quality. But that wasn't what made her heart seize. What made the blood rush from her head was the clarity. She was alone in the shot, but the composition made it feel like she was being observed from incredibly close range, perhaps even from the rooftop across the street, a perspective only an elite professional or an obsessed stalker could manage. Her expression was unguarded, vulnerable, a quiet melancholy in the curve of her mouth that she hadn't even realized was there. She was a professional photographer, specializing in abstract architectural shots, focusing on the geometry of shadows and light. She knew lighting, she knew perspective, and she knew the chilling skill it took to capture this moment. She immediately checked her locks, her windows, and then stared out into the neon-washed night, seeing nothing but shadows that looked suddenly malevolent. 2 days later, the second photo arrived. This time it was tucked into the pocket of her favorite coat, which she had left at the dry cleaners. She hadn't noticed it until she was hanging the coat up, the heavy stock of the paper scratching her palm. This photo was different, more unsettling, and infinitely more intriguing. It was still her, but not alone. She was walking through a crowded market, focused on the textures of a street vendor's stall, and slightly out of focus. Just behind her shoulder was a man. He was a blur of tailored dark wool and sharp angular jawline, a ghost of an observer. Only his profile was visible, but the sheer force of his presence seemed to bend the light around him. His eyes, though slightly shadowed, appeared to be fixed entirely on her. He wasn't smiling or lurking. He looked like a statue of intense, focused attention, as if nothing else in the bustling market existed. Ilara found herself spending hours staring at the picture, not at herself, but at the man. His dark hair was meticulously styled, just touching the collar of his coat. His hand was barely visible, slipping into the pocket of his trousers, the posture conveying a profound, almost dangerous stillness. Who was he? Was he the one taking the photos, or was he another subject like her caught in the lens of a mutual watcher? The unsettling nature of the surveillance slowly began to transform into something else, an electrifying, almost perverse curiosity. She was a professional of the gaze. Now she was the object of one, and the quality of the work was undeniable. It made her feel alive in a way her architectural contracts never could. The third photo was where the script changed, where the abstract geometry of her fear gave way to the tangible heat of desire. It arrived the following week, pushed into her mailbox, folded once. When she smoothed it out on her light table, a low gasp escaped her lips. It was a picture of them together. She was at a quiet, hidden jazz bar she frequented, sitting at the counter, her eyes closed, listening to the saxophone player. The man, the same angular silhouette, was seated 2 stools down. His body was turned toward her, one arm resting casually on the bar. His head was tilted slightly, and the low golden light of the bar caught the line of his throat and the intensity of his gaze as he watched her. The moment captured was not one of interaction, but of proximity and silent magnetic pull. It radiated a potent shared tension. She remembered that night. She remembered feeling a distinct, heavy presence nearby, a sense that the air itself had thickened, but she had never dared to look. Now she saw. He had been there. He had been watching. The next day, Ilara decided to take control of the narrative. She didn't call the police. She didn't change her routine. Instead, she put on the black silk dress she saved for gallery openings, applied her deepest shade of lipstick, and went back to the jazz bar. She sat exactly where she had been in the photo. She ordered the same drink. She closed her eyes, waiting. The air shifted almost immediately. When she opened her eyes, he was there. Not 2 stools down, but directly on the stool next to hers. He was taller than she had imagined, with eyes the color of dark whiskey and a mouth that looked carved from stone. He wore a crisp white shirt beneath a blazer that spoke of careful, expensive tailoring. "I believe," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that felt less spoken and more felt, "you've been looking for me." Ilara's breath hitched, not from fear but from the sudden visceral rush of realizing the fantasy had become reality. "I believe," she countered, her voice surprisingly steady, "that you made certain I would." He smiled then, a slow, deliberate movement that softened the hard lines of his face. "I am Elias Thorne, Ilara Vance." They didn't talk about the photos, not immediately. They talked about architecture, about the honest curve of a bridge, the way light failed in a concrete corridor. They spoke the language of shadows and geometry, a common lexicon that quickly stripped away the mundane. But beneath every sentence, every shared glance, was the heavy, unspoken acknowledgement of the secret lens that had brought them together. On the third night of their meeting, Elias took her back to his loft. It was a cathedral of steel and glass, minimalist to the extreme, with views that made the city look like a scattered collection of jewels. She felt the suspense of the preceding weeks gather in the room, taut and almost painful. "Tell me," she demanded, turning to face him, the city lights illuminating the sharp curve of her collarbone. "Were you the one who took them? The photos?" Elias walked slowly toward her, his expression unreadable. He reached up, his fingers brushing the line of her jaw, tilting her head up just slightly, perfectly. "I was the subject," he confessed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I was also the conspirator. I noticed the lens on us the very first time. I realized someone was documenting our accidental proximity, documenting the story before it began." His thumb ran a soft, exploratory path across her lower lip, and Ilara felt a deep, primal shudder run through her. "And you let them continue?" she asked, her voice breathy, the question already rhetorical. "I encouraged them," he admitted, his eyes holding hers, dark and intense. "I knew the photographer was a voyeur of intense, hidden moments. I wanted that moment of discovery for you. I wanted you to become obsessed with the shadow, so you could finally step into the light. The eroticism of the moment wasn't in the action, but in the shared, intense intimacy of the surveillance, the profound knowledge that someone else had seen their connection before they themselves had acknowledged it. It was the thrill of the forbidden, of being utterly and completely seen." He leaned in, and the kiss was a statement, possessive, urgent, and fueled by weeks of unspoken longing. It was a confirmation of the attraction that had been captured on film. Their clothes became heavy constraints, meaningless barriers to the electric connection that had been building since the first glossy photo arrived. When he finally pulled back, he lifted her into his arms, his mouth moving from her neck to her ear. "Tonight there are no shadows," he murmured, his hands tracing the silk of her dress. "Only clarity." The following weeks were a dizzying blur of stolen time and intense passion. Their romance thrived in secrecy, a private world constructed of his minimalist aesthetic and her bohemian warmth. The eroticism was a consistent, subtle thrum beneath the surface of their lives, manifesting in the way he would photograph her with his phone, capturing fleeting moments of her reading or laughing, recreating the thrill of the original surveillance, but this time with consent and devotion. One morning, Ilara awoke in Elias's bed, the early sun cutting sharp geometric patterns across the floor. She found a new photo waiting, not under the door or in a coat, but placed on the breakfast table, prominently displayed against the white marble. This time it wasn't a photo of them together or separately. It was a close-up, highly detailed photograph of a unique, antique silver locket Ilara had once lost years ago, a piece of jewelry she hadn't thought of in years. It was lying on a dark wooden surface, slightly open, revealing nothing inside. This was no longer about attraction. This was personal. This was threatening. The message was clear. The shadow photographer was still watching, still escalating, and knew things about her past that Elias could not. When Elias came out, wrapping a silk robe around his sculpted body, he looked at the photo, and his face hardened instantly. "I should have known," he muttered, picking up the print. "The one taking the pictures isn't just a voyeur. He's the architect of this whole scenario." "Who?" Ilara whispered, the passion of the last few weeks evaporating into cold dread. Elias sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. A former business partner, Julian Varenne. He was obsessed with my work, obsessed with control. When I broke away, he swore he would dismantle everything I cared about, piece by piece, starting with the structure of my life. He saw you, and he saw a perfect, beautiful way to manipulate me. He took those early photos to draw me in, knowing I would recognize the shot composition. Ilara felt sick. So our relationship, it was engineered. The initial meeting was engineered by Julian's lens, Elias corrected, pulling her close, the scent of his skin a desperate comfort. But everything since then, this connection, this fire, is entirely ours. Julian is a master manipulator. He's not interested in us. He's interested in seeing me lose control. Elias, the man of precision, began to unravel, his voice tight with barely contained fury. They spent the next 48 hours in a whirlwind of fear and planning, trying to trace Julian, to predict his next move. Then the final terrifying photo arrived. It was sent to Ilara's personal email, attached to an anonymous message, "Game over." The photograph was shocking in its stillness. It was a dimly lit warehouse interior. A single figure was slumped against a cold concrete wall, perfectly framed by a stark shaft of moonlight. It was Elias. His head was bowed, his white shirt stained a shocking dark crimson. There was no doubt in the immediate paralyzing moment. Elias Thorne was dead. Ilara's world shattered. She dropped her phone, the glass cracking against the marble floor, but she didn't notice. The image, though not graphically detailed, was devastatingly composed to convey finality. The photographer had chosen the angle, the light, the setting to be the ultimate crushing climax of his surveillance project. She turned, ready to scream, to call for help, to collapse into hopeless despair. But the apartment was empty. Elias had gone out hours ago, saying he needed to follow a lead, to finally confront Julian. The grief was a physical force tearing through her chest, but a strange, professional instinct kicked in. She was a photographer. She knew how easily reality could be manufactured. She crawled to her laptop, retrieving the digital file, zooming in, analyzing the shadows, the textures, the light, the blood. The way Elias's hand was positioned, it was too dramatic. It was a tableau. "It's too perfect," her inner critic screamed. "It's staged." She grabbed her coat and her camera bag, a sudden, fierce conviction stealing her spine. She wasn't going to call the police yet. She was going to the location in the photo. She recognized the unique, vaulted ceiling. It was an abandoned shipyard warehouse Julian Varenne had recently acquired. The drive was a terrifying blur of desperate hope and crushing fear. When she arrived, the massive steel doors were slightly ajar. She slipped inside. Her camera held like a shield. The warehouse was as cold and vast as it looked in the photo. The moonlight pierced the grime-coated windows, creating the same geometric light she had obsessed over. And there, against the wall, was the scene. But the body was gone. Instead, a fresh photo was taped to the concrete wall, directly where the dead body had been. It was a photo of a single, dark figure standing in a doorway, captured from the back, shoulders slumped in apparent defeat. The figure wasn't Elias. It was Julian Varenne. And beside the photo, scratched into the concrete with a piece of metal, were 3 words: "He tried to escape." Then, a sound behind her. A heavy steel door creaked shut, plunging the warehouse into near-total darkness. Save for the geometric shafts of moonlight, Ilara spun around, her heart hammering. "Ilara?" a familiar resonant voice whispered from the gloom. "Elias?" she cried, relief washing over her with such force it almost buckled her knees. He emerged from the deeper shadow unharmed, though his white shirt was indeed torn and dirtied. "I'm sorry," he said, rushing to her, pulling her into a tight, grounding embrace. "I had to make him believe he'd won. I knew he was watching. I knew he would send you the photo as his grand finale. I staged it, the fall, the blood. It was stage makeup, Ilara, the same stuff they use in films. I needed to lure him to this spot, to this precise moment where he felt safe, where he felt he could make his getaway." Julian Varenne, defeated and bound, was visible in the deepest shadows, tied to a large shipping crate. He was pale and shaking, the orchestrator of their fear now entirely powerless. "I didn't harm him, Ilara," Elias assured her, sensing her question. "But I called the authorities the moment I had him secured. They're on their way. He won't be able to hurt anyone else. The photographer is out of film." Ilara sagged against him, the terror slowly leaching out of her body, replaced by a profound, overwhelming love for this intense, dramatic, and protective man. "You staged your own death," she murmured against his chest, shaking her head in disbelief. "Only the best staging for my leading lady," he replied, pulling back just enough to look into her eyes. It was the only way to get him to drop his guard. He was obsessed with the photograph, the perfect composition. He wouldn't believe it was fake if it looked that good. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, their red and blue lights flashing against the warehouse walls. The drama was over. Julian's plot, driven by ego and jealousy, had collapsed under the weight of his own dramatic obsession. A few months later, the fear was a distant echo, replaced by a profound, rooted connection. Elias and Ilara were more than just lovers. They were collaborators, their lives interwoven with shared projects and intense, private moments. They stood together on the balcony of their new shared apartment, overlooking the entire glittering expanse of the city they had once navigated in fear. Ilara leaned back against Elias's chest, the night air cool on her skin. "You know," Ilara said softly, tracing the line of his hand resting on her hip, "I still don't regret the beginning. The thrill of the forbidden photograph, the sense of being found by a stranger who already knew me. It was intoxicating." Elias turned her around to face him, his eyes heavy with affection. "The shadows played their part, but they don't define us, we define the light." He kissed her then, a long, leisurely kiss that spoke of domestic bliss layered over intense passion. His hand slipped beneath the thin silk of her nightgown, exploring the curve of her waist. The familiar, comforting weight of his touch, sending a current of heat through her body. The low, guttural sound he made against her lips confirmed the enduring, erotic connection that had been born in the lens of a stalker. "Let's take a photograph," Elias whispered, his mouth moving to the sensitive spot beneath her ear, causing her to arch slightly into his embrace. "Our photo, the one that tells the truth." Ilara smiled, her heart full. They stood there, facing the city, illuminated by the apartment's soft interior glow and the endless anonymous lights of the city. Elias held his phone up, not a professional camera, just a simple capture of a private moment. Click. The resulting photograph was simple. It was them, wrapped in an intimate embrace, their eyes locked not on the camera but on each other. There was no melodrama, no forced composition, no lurking shadow, just clarity, just love. It was the perfect final closing shot of their story, taken by the only photographer that mattered, themselves. Their happy ending was a picture of certainty, a stark contrast to the thrilling, terrifying, anonymous shot that had started it all. They finally had the beautiful, unguarded image they had always deserved. They had found love, trust, and intense passion, all thanks to the man who thought he could use a camera to destroy them. The shadow photographer had failed, and in doing so, had created their light.